Hello, members of the channel, and welcome back to more member-exclusive content, this time with the Genre Guys. That's the official name we're giving these conversations. You all loved and responded to the discussion of Westerns, their rise, their fall, the future, and so we thought we might do this again. Tommy Tables, Lorn Conner, and L.W. Ghost here to chat about the pulp genre and its return in the 90s. I suspect you all are going to love this, and I'm going to love it as well. But I'm going to hop out and hand it over to Tommy Tables as they begin yet another in a series of fantastic discussions. Let's go now to Tommy.
Thank you very much, Pro. Hello, Lorn. Hello, LW Ghost. And hello, audience members. We will first of all, thank you for listening to the conversation that we had on Westerns. I understand that it was that you guys liked it, and you liked it so much that, well, we're hoping that you'll continue to like the conversations that we have. Today, we're going to be talking about not Westerns, but about something else, which is, I think, a little bit near and dear to our hearts, the pulp heroes, the precursors to the MCU, to the DC universe, to heck, to Batman, to Superman, to Spider-Man, to all of those characters. And as you may or may not be aware, there was a little bit of a resurgence in popularity of these heroes back in the 90s. It was almost kind of like a prototype of the superhero trend that sort of swept the nation for the past 15 years. And among those movies, you had characters like The Phantom, starring Billy Zane of Titanic fame, The Shadow, starring Alec Baldwin, and a number of others. So on that note, this is the genre we're going to talk about today. We're either going to go with the Genre Guys or the Genre Gents, I think was Pro's suggestion, so let us know which name you guys prefer. But Lorn, LW Ghost, thank you so much for agreeing to do this again. And have you guys done your homework? Have you rewatched The Phantom?
I didn't have to. I remember it clearly. I mean I liked everything about it but Billy Zane.
I actually saw the movie when it released in 96. I was not a fan of the movie, and so I have avoided it since that point. I did rewatch it today. My main reason for dislike is the same as LW's. I'm not a huge fan of Billy Zane, but I wanted to go into it kind of keeping my mind clear, trying to give it a fairer shake than I think I would have before. All set and ready to talk about it tonight.
And I think, Treat Williams is wonderful in it. My dear old friend Patrick McGowan is wonderful in it. It just, to me, those pirate bad guys in The Phantom verged awfully darn close to the Goonies territory, and it just didn't make it for me.
Very true. Well, you know what? I had seen it quite a long time ago, and I did not. I remember kind of leaving it thinking, this is okay. And so I like Lorn, I kind of went back and rewatched it with an open mind, and I kind of enjoyed it a little. But before we get into the nitty gritty of this movie in particular, I just want to point out too that there were other films of this era that ended up sort of becoming remade. So you had Dick Tracy in 1990. You had Darkman, although I don't think he was necessarily a very pulp era sort of hero.
He was an attempt to create a pulp era hero after the pulp era, I think.
There you go.
And it was done because Sam Raimi tried to obtain the rights to produce a Shadow movie and could not get them. Yep. So he created his own in the hopes of spawning off a franchise.
And maybe we should explain to people who may not be as ancient as I am, and even I am not ancient enough to remember directly, what the heck the pulps means. There were magazines that carried short stories, long stories, novellas, and full-length 80-page books of all of these great, not quite super, but certainly, let's say, talented detectives and crime fighters. You've got the Green Hornet, you've got the Shadow, and of course all of them were on radio in the golden era of radio. People may not know this, but one of Orson Welles' first big hit jobs was playing the Shadow when he was 22 years old. And I saw an interview of him recently when he was on with Tom Snyder, And he said he could never get the laugh right, that they had somebody else just before the show do the Shadow's famous laugh, and then he'd imitate it and get it close.
Sorry, LW, I gotta interrupt you there. What's a radio? Is that some sort of...
Well, since my mother was indeed an actress in radio, well, actually, God, I'll find the link and I'll send it to you all. Stan Freberg had a show in the 50s that people said, what is radio? Because people didn't know what radio was because television had taken over. And he did this brilliant sketch, and the sketch was all sound effects. And he said, all right, we're going to show you what radio was. Bring in the giant tank trucks, and you hear rumbling. All right, drain Lake Michigan, and you hear sloshing of water. All right, bring in the tank trucks full of hot chocolate, and in come more trucks. Pump the chocolate, and you hear sloshing. Bring in the B-52 bomber with the giant marshmallow, and you hear the plane and the plummet and the splash. And he says, do that on television. It was the theater of the mind. It was characters and people that you never saw what they looked like. You never, except maybe when the actors did personal appearances, but you put your mind into the show. It told a story. You weren't totally naked to make it up yourself. But, it's like I always said when the movie, the Ralph Bakshi movie of Lord of the Rings stuff came out, that I hated it because everybody who read the books had their own vision in their head of what an orc looked like and what a hobbit looked like with the descriptions given. And once you set it in stone that way, and certainly with the successful movies later, all of that imagination process was done for you. In many ways, audiences couldn't be as lazy as they can be at a movie or a TV show. They had to contribute their own imaginations to the experience. And of course they were done with orchestras and organs and music and sound effects, and they told stories. And some were comedies, and some were detectives, and some were westerns. My mother played the Cisco Kid's girlfriend for years. She was on Sherlock Holmes with Basil Rathbone and Nigel Bruce. All of these things, they were entertainment, and they stretched across the country.
And kind of what's interesting about this is that we are talking about almost prototypical superheroes, and they go back even farther before the radio era. If you really want to get down to it, we're talking about H. Rider Haggard and the Alan Quatermain novels. You've got Zorro, who was a major inspiration for Batman and is actually referenced in Batman as the movie that he goes to, is kind of an Easter egg for people who don't know that. You've got the Scarlet Pimpernel. You've got all of these pulp heroes who eventually, they were the inspirations for what would become your later heroes that we know today.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, among those, a little bit of interesting trivia is that apparently the Phantom, which was created quite a long time ago, I believe the character first appeared, if Wikipedia is not leading me astray, back in 1936. And two of the characteristics of the Phantom, and again, for those who don't know, this is a guy who's basically in a full-on kind of spandexy purple bodysuit with a domino mask across his eyes, kind of like Robin. It was the first time we saw somebody wearing one of these kind of superhero tight suits and with whites for their eyes instead of actually seeing the pupils, which is kind of what inspires Batman, a whole bunch of other heroes like Spawn and the like. So all of these pulp heroes like the Phantom and others like the Rocketeer, the Shadow, they were basically kind of laying the foundation for the superheroes we know and love. Like if I guess the best way to put it would be a bit of a metaphor, like the Titans laid the path for the Greek gods that we all sort of came to know and love, and the Greek gods being like, Superman, Batman, and all those. I don't know. What do you guys think of that?
Well, but also remember that most of these guys did not have superpowers per se.
Yeah.
I mean, Shadow had this ability to quote unquote cloud men's minds so they could not see him. Great.
Yep.
Swell. But he didn't have super strength. He wasn't invulnerable. And by the way, they all carried guns.
That is interesting.
As did Batman at the very beginning.
Yep.
Yeah, and they were kind of known in that era as mystery men. They hadn't really come up with the concept of the superhero yet. That was to come in the very near future.
And it's funny that when you think about it, the TV show Takeoff on the Green Hornet, which was done by the same people who brought you the Batman '66 thing, never quite worked or caught on maybe because he wasn't super enough. He was pretty civilian. He was a rich guy with a fancy car, and of course he had Bruce Lee to kick the bad guys' butts. But we got spoiled, I guess is what I'm saying, by all the superpowers, perhaps. Perhaps.
It's entirely possible. I mean, that was one of the things that I was kind of thinking about when I was watching rewatching the Phantom movie, was that, so he doesn't actually have any superpowers, does he? Like, I mean, part of the appeal of the Phantom, or I suppose the mystique of the Phantom, was that he was a legacy character. And so every time a Phantom, one of the Phantoms in the costume died, their son would take over. And so the story goes that they would, people would think that this person was actually immortal, that he was unkillable.
The ghost who walks.
The ghost who walks, yeah. But it was interesting how mortal that character was. Like, I mean, he was sort of, well, we'll get into that, I'm sure.
He did manage to take a 12-inch knife to the abdomen pretty well.
Well, goes with the territory.
And he can talk to animals. So
yes.
Maybe we can give a quick overview of what this movie is about. Would you like to do that, Lauren? Would you like to do that, LW, or would you like me to do that? Lauren, you gave such a great overview of the black hole the other day. I think you can do it.
So I'll do my best. The story goes that in the 1600s, that a young boy whose family is aboard a merchant ship is attacked by pirates, and his family is killed. And he manages to escape overboard from the ship and make his way to the island of Bengali, where he is met by natives who, in a ceremony, gift him with this skull ring talisman, and he eventually takes on the identity of the Phantom. And his purpose is to fight fight pirates and those who are greedy and corrupt, and bring them to justice. He makes his lair in a skull cave. And given the fact that this has gone down this family line, there have been 21 Phantoms from the 1600s until the present day of the movie. That's sort of the framing device for the Phantom. In this particular movie, you have a sort of power-hungry industrialist who has become aware of these mystical skulls that will give him unlimited power in some way that is rather vague throughout the movie, but you just kind of go with it. And through a series of adventures and mishaps, the Phantom has to stop him from acquiring these skulls and return.
Kind of like Infinity Stones. Where have we seen this plot?
Yeah, that's actually a good point.
yeah. It's back in the early 30s. A lot of these heroes did have a mystical bent. The Shadow, especially so. They were oftentimes dealing with. It's the same thing that you have with Indiana Jones and those era of heroes. In the Pulp era, a lot of times you were dealing with far-off mystical lands and exotic cultures and the treasures that they hid or guarded. And so part of the reason that these have fallen out of favor in the modern day is that in the parlance of the modern culture, that's promoting imperialism. One of the things, or colonialism, one of the things that I think is funny that people seem to miss about that, though, is that most of these stories were saying, maybe you shouldn't mess with the natives' treasure because bad things happen when you do.
The other thing to remember is that the audience reading these or listening to them on the radio back in the day, most of them have never been on an airplane. Most of them certainly will never venture outside of their town, let alone their state, let alone their country. And so these exotic locales were really, really, really exciting, and they didn't have to be accurate because there was nobody to fact check them, And so, and especially, I guess, in a more xenophobic era, making all the bad guys Chinese or Indian or, let's face it, if the second indie movie was made today, they'd be mightily angry that the bad guy is so obviously not white. And he's out there drinking blood from skulls and all the other nasty stuff that he does. But this was a window on a world that most people could only imagine and filled in the blanks of their imagination nicely.
Yeah, one of the things that I was going to say, though, is that there's actually a reference in Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom that it's sort of an unofficial sequel to a Rudyard Kipling story.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it's referencing the Thuggy cult from I cannot think of the name of the story right now. It slipped my mind, but it's one of his most famous. And so you're going right back to that pulp origin again.
I actually, in looking at artwork, I sent you a link to some of the artwork involved in the shadow earlier, Tommy.
Yeah, I saw that.
There was one in there that was a comic book cover of Indy and the Shadow
Oh,
from I guess 70s, 80s. I don't know when, but it was amazing to me that somebody made that connection in an actual comic book. So
Yeah,
go
and
figure.
something else that's kind of interesting about this is that even though we're talking about pulp and golden age heroes in this talk, they've never completely gone away. I was actually surprised while doing the research for the Phantom today to find that they're still publishing the comic strip. It was a newspaper comic strip. That's where it came from. The Shadow has been revived many, many times. And so they're still going concerns. The Shadow, one of the things that's interesting about the Shadow, one of the contemporaries of the Phantom, is that he wasn't originally a character. He was the announcer for other horror and mystery themed radio shows who had this creepy voice that he opened who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men.
yes.
The Shadow knows.
Well, that's good. That's better than
and-
Orson's laugh.
And people would call into the radio station and ask who the Shadow character was. It created such a sensation because people wanted to know, who is this mysterious announcer? He's got such a great voice. And they decided they needed to create a character around that. And so he got his own show and later his own magazine. Street and Smith published all of these beautiful magazines with these covers that Lou's talking about.
And you have to remember that there were lots of these anthology mystery horror shows on the radio. There was one called The Whistler, where the host like that who whistled at the beginning and told you the story. Kind of, in a way, if any of you have ever seen like the Crypt Keeper, the EC comics, where there were the hosts who told the story, or the Tales from the Crypt TV show.
Yeah.
And then they, like you say, evolved into my mother's first job in radio. She was at high school, and there was a show called The Black Chapel, which was one of these anthology horror mystery shows. And the opening of the show was, "It's the Black Gong Chapel Gong," and a woman screams.
Oh,
That was my mom.
wow.
She got paid, this has got to be just before World War II sometime. She got paid $20 a week and dinner to come in, scream. They did the show. She wasn't in the show. And then they'd all go to dinner. Then they'd come back and do it again for the West Coast because, of course, they didn't have the tape delay or recordings of it in those days. And that was a hell of a gig for a high school girl. You know, you got dinner and $20 for screaming twice. And
Wow.
those are the kind of shows that there were in those days. And, of course, eventually the reason why continuing characters took off was because it was something you could sell breakfast cereal and decoder rings and all the other goodies based around. You couldn't do that with an anthology. And in fact, in some of these anthology shows, it was the author that became the star. Look at Arch Obler was a guy who wrote these very wonderful, weird, spooky, akin to nowadays, or not quite nowadays, Rod Serling with Twilight Zone, or even Hitchcock hosting his show. It gave people a personality to tie in around, even if they weren't the star of the individual episode.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I mean, a lot has to be said for that. I think, again, people don't realize that there was no recording. It was live, essentially.
Well,
so
they took transcriptions, but they weren't really worth a damn as far as broadcast was concerned, and certainly not right away, an hour or two later, or 3 hours later for the other coast.
Right.
Yeah, they had to work fast, and one of the fun things, if you ever listen to the old radio broadcasts, is that they would do commercials in the middle of the show, too. And
Oh, yeah.
I think my favorite for the Shadow was they were always pitching blue coal, the finest anthracite that you could get in the Northeast. And it's always fun to listen to those old advertisements.
Well, on Sherlock Holmes, The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes that my mother was on, it's Dr. Watson talking to the announcer, a guy named Paul Bartel, and telling him, I'll tell you the story of back when Sherlock and I did this and that and the other. And they're doing it, enjoying a glass of Petri wine, which was the sponsor. And then they do commercials for it.
It seems very much like some of the YouTube stars in this day and age when you're listening to one of them ranting along and then all of a sudden they're like, yes, I actually enjoy this, back cream that I use.
Or
and
the
so you're like, wait a
VPNs
minute.
yeah.
No, well, I mean,
I watch a lot of whiskey tube stuff, and they're all advertising this probiotic that's supposed to keep you from getting hungover. So
oh,
have a drink of this before your binge, and you won't be quite so sick tomorrow, or something.
I'm going to
like
have
that.
to do some research on that, I think. Well, so
If you
on
say so.
yeah,
TMI, Tommy, TMI.
yeah. So on that note then, about the Phantom movie itself, did you guys like it the second time? Well, Lou, I mean, you've already
I've seen
watched
it a couple of times,
You've seen
and
it a couple of times.
I've liked moments,
Uh-huh.
but when you can't get behind the hero because he's such a, I don't know, he's a wimp with muscles. Never mind the ghost who walks.
Yeah.
But
Well, that's something that, so there were a few things that struck me when I was watching this movie again, and one of those was what you pointed out, the fact that the Phantom kind of sucks. Like he was just getting like he wasn't really doing much, didn't really show a lot of skill, and kind of got beaten up a lot. And I mean, there was a running gag throughout the entire movie about how his dad got stabbed in the back, and well, how mortal they all were. Now, all that to be said, though, I recognize that it's a product of its time, and maybe they could have used a better choreographer. But you get the sense that the one sort of heroic moment where the hero finally shows up and he's ready to kick ass never really kind of happened in this movie.
Well, I think there's a couple other things too, and that is, I don't buy it's a product of its time, because what kicked off this renaissance was Batman '89, and it was just fine. I'm going to disagree with Lou a little bit when it comes to Treat Williams. I don't think Treat Williams knew what he was doing in this movie.
it looked like he was having fun, and nobody else in the movie does.
Yeah, he was chewing the scenery like crazy.
Yeah, he does that sometimes.
One thing I was shocked to find was I forgot that Catherine Zeta-Jones was in this. It's like,
Yeah.
what was she doing in this movie? But the major impression that I got out of this movie was that if you've ever been to a studio lot tour where they do the stunt shows, this movie felt like you were actually watching the stunt show. When you're watching a stunt show on the lot, the stunts, they're obviously stunts. You can see that they're stunts. You can admire the skill of the stuntmen, but it doesn't look the way that it looks on the movie screen. This looked like you had filmed the stunt show without doing the magic to make it not look like a stunt show.
Well,
Yeah.
and remember, the only place that stunt shows happen all at once, except for a couple of rare occasions, one of which would blow my cover, is on the studio backlot, because on the set, you're shooting it in, 14, 15, 18, 30 takes of pieces and bits and angles and cutting it together and making magic in the editing room. So, although I know of one show where they did it all live because it was in front of an audience, even to the point of having a guy with a keyboard with all of those chopsocky sound effects on it, punching them in at the appropriate punch points just for the audience's enjoyment.
That's amazing.
Yeah,
Sorry, go on, Lauren.
I thought the final pirate base as well looked like they had just filmed it on Pirates of the Caribbean. It just looked to me like something about this project looked cheap, but it had lots of the names that were attached to this was surprising. This was an Alan Ladd Jr. picture.
Yeah.
And I was just kind of shocked to see all of the names that were associated with it, and yet this is what we got.
And see, that's why I think The Shadow is so much more wonderful and worthy of our attention, if I may be so bold.
Sure.
Because, first of all, Russell Mulcahy, the director, who people will know most from The Highlander, and I was mentioning to you guys in backstage notes, here's a guy that came entirely out of music videos. Back before that was as common as it is now. He did all of Elton John's music videos and lots of other big stars. And yet when he came to the feature world, he carried with him what I call the economy of storytelling. Now, I'm not saying that some of those videos aren't very big budget with lots of dancers and cast and sets. That's not the part of it I'm talking about, but I'm talking about you tell a lot of story in 3.5 minutes. If you keep doing that in a movie, you get an exciting movie with lots of punch. But it seems like nowadays, these guys that come out of music video that are directing pictures for companies that we all know and love, they lose all that. They get flabby storytelling, and I don't know why they lost it, but it's like, oh, now I have all the money to sit around and twiddle my thumbs for 20 minutes and explain exposition. Mulcahy would never have done that and never did. Also, you had David Koepp writing it, and he invented the whole backstory, which never appeared in the comics. That he said, how could Lamont Cranston know what evil is in people if there isn't evil in him? And starting him off as this really bad guy who is now fighting against the evil in himself in the process of beating the bad guy, who, for those who haven't seen the movie, is Genghis Khan's latest relative who's out to conquer the world, if that isn't enough for you, played by the great John Lone. And then you've got everybody from Tim Curry to
Ian
McKellen to
Yeah.
Penelope Ann Miller to Jonathan Winters, and great music by Jerry Goldsmith, and a great theme song. I sent you the video of Taylor Dane singing this song about, I'm looking for an original sin because I've done all the old ones until I'm done in. Fun stuff. Fun stuff. And the cinematography.
Yeah.
They did this thing with very, very little CGI because there was very, very little CGI to be done in those days.
Yeah.
And how this guy lit it so that rather than doing some fancy trick of when he's turning into the shadow, he simply leans back out of the light, and now all you see is his mouth saying what he's saying as shadow, and his face is in the dark. And lots of little things like that, and of course set in the glory of the 30s as far as costumes and sets and a big nightclub and all kinds of other fun things.
One thing I have to point out, though, is that, I don't know if you guys are aware of this, but the mystical dagger, Furba, was voiced by Frank Welker, who is the original voice of Megatron from the Transformers cartoon.
Well, Frank Welker is a very, very busy voice guy, or was, and did everything. My God.
Sorry, Lauren, I think I cut you off there. Okay, go on.
Oh,
One of the things that was, there's always an image of the shadow that you see where it's kind of a cutaway of his face where it's just the eyes and the hooked nose. One of the things about the shadow is that when he is using his power to cloud men's minds, when he is acting as the shadow, he appears much creepier than he does as Lamont Cranston. And his eyes in that profile are framed in shadow like you were talking about. They did that brilliantly in the movie. By making his eyes go dark.
And the fans blowing his cape in ripples, and later her dress, and it just...
But in the trailers and in the marketing for the thing, they would go from that cut where you would see Alec Baldwin dramatically turn towards the camera, and they'd zoom into that little stretch of his eyes and his nose, and then they would zoom back, and it would now be the key art for the movie.
Yeah.
That was like the classic stuff. It was just a brilliant marketing campaign.
Is there an explanation for why the Shadow's nose would always get so much bigger when he had this cape on? His scarf on?
I don't know who in the original Street and Smith Illos, came up with that as his image, but it sure worked.
Yeah.
I always interpreted it as that's actually what he really looks like, but that he is using his power to cloud men's minds constantly to make him appear as this handsome playboy philanthropist, Lamont Cranston.
That is an interesting
So
theory.
Bruce Wayne really does look like a bat?
Something like that.
The man behind the curtain.
Yes.
No, that, watching the Shadow again, I have to say Alec Baldwin, he's got a very distinctive voice, but I think he pulled the laugh off pretty well. I mean, Lauren, you also were very good at that too, a little bit earlier just now. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm not an Alec Baldwin fan either, but this movie, he owned the role. He did a really good job with it. It's probably my favorite Alec Baldwin movie.
Mine too.
He did a perfect job as the Shadow.
And then all of the technology within the movie, the pneumatic tubes going through the city for the Shadow's agents to send him reports. And it's a movie about the atomic bomb, by the way, in the 1930s. The beryllium sphere, as they say.
I got that reference. Well, one thing that I will say, and I'm going to drag you both back kicking and screaming to the Phantom again, because one thing I will say, which I was really stunned by, was that I ended up watching the movie The Phantom during the day, actually earlier today. This is a Saturday, and I was with my 8-year-old boy, and he's never, like, so far he has expressed zero interest in anything related to superheroes or sci-fi or what have you. And yet he was glued to the entire movie. And I was kind of sitting there looking at it, and I'm like, wow, like, what is this? Like, I mean, I've tried to sit through,
I hope it's Catherine Zeta-Jones.
It could be.
And if not, the horse, maybe, because...
But that... Sorry,
I know what it is.
What?
It's pirates and its exotic locales, and it is the swashbuckling adventure story. All kids love that. This is why pulps appeal to that age range, and it's why back in the day the radio shows did that with all the decoder rings and everything. If you know a Christmas Story, the Little Orphan Annie decoder ring, that's of that era, and that's why they did it. Is that, I mean, even, gosh, I'm gonna age myself here, but back in the day, they used to put toys in the cereal boxes. At some point,
I was just about to say the cereal.
Hey, I remember that.
Yeah, and it worked. You
could cut things out from the box and fold them certain ways and make little things out of them.
And it absolutely worked. But part of my love of the pulp era actually came from a cereal box. I don't remember which cereal it was, but I do remember that it was Egyptian themed. They had this Egyptian themed mystery on the back. And inside the cereal box, there was a folded up kind of a map style thing that, like Lou said, you had to fold a certain way to decode a secret message to solve the mystery of the mummy's tomb. And I thought that was so cool as a kid because it made me feel like I was solving this ancient mystery, like you were a tomb raider. Wow. And that appeals to kids of a certain age.
I don't remember that, but I remember a lot of them used to have like crossword puzzles on the back that were on a particular theme.
Or magic tricks. You could get magic tricks in the box.
Yes.
And
amaze your friends.
It still appeals to kids in this day and age because, again, for the same son, I had bought them this Super Mario sort of like workbook / playbook thing where you could have like puzzles and crosswords and mazes and whatever. And one of them was a reversed word that you had to hold up to the mirror to see what the word was. And he just loved
they did a lot of that.
Yep.
A lot of that.
He was just like, "Dad, this is so cool," and I'm like, "Yeah, I guess it kind of is, isn't it?"
Well, see, this is one of the things that I wouldn't fault the Phantom for. It was perfectly grounded in the time of the movie. It captured that feel, and I think that may have been part of what detracted from it, as it almost did the aw shucks golden age superhero a little bit too well.
Yeah.
But it looked gorgeous. It was a gorgeous looking movie.
Well, that's.
And then, of course, the moderner, God, that's a terrible word, incarnation of this has to be Rocketeer.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember seeing Rocketeer at the El Capitan when Disney had just finished revamping it into the glory that it is. And they had James Horner, who did the Rocketeer score, also write this piece as a curtain show, as they called it, where when you sat down in the El Capitan, and it still runs today, but I think they've changed the music and some of the effects. And these curtains sequentially would open with music that was ultimate Hollywood and the stars kind of music. And then the very first frame of the Rocketeer was a totally black frame, and it came up and it said, Los Angeles, 1930, whatever it was, 7, 8, 9. And slowly it opens because a guy is pushing open. You're inside a totally dark hangar at the airfield where the movie takes place.
Yep.
And it was like that whole setup and that whole theater puts you in that time so beautifully that you could, do no wrong. Any Rocketeer fans, by the way, that little dog-shaped hot dog stand that they go to is actually sitting in the Peterson Museum on Wilshire Boulevard as part of the display for old cars. So
no kidding.
Yeah.
And honestly, if you want to know where the inspiration for Boba Fett came from and later the Mandalorian, it was that breed of heroes. You had the Rocketeer, you had Captain Midnight, you had there were a couple of other rocket-themed superheroes that were on radio and little serial shorts and things like that. That's where Boba Fett came from. So
I remember Rocket Robin Hood. That's an old cartoon.
Yeah. And, of course, Flash Gordon, that whole era, too.
Buck Rogers, yeah.
Yeah, Buck Rogers.
Wow.
And they're all still sort of around, and that's the thing. I mean, These people, wittingly or otherwise, tapped into something pretty elemental in all of our inner soul quest for adventure. It's a human thing. Doesn't matter what
I
civilization you're in, you know.
I think Buck Rogers is entering the public domain this year. I think
Probably a lot of these are, but beady.
Well, you might start seeing new stuff coming up because of that, though, and that's kind of cool because you could see revivals of some of these heroes that actually inspired the later movies that you all know now.
Yeah.
If you think about it, the plot of Buck Rogers is Planet of the Apes. It's the guys who go off and wind up on a planet, and whoops, surprise, it's Earth. Not quite the same, but you know.
But you know, I'm just going back to I can't express enough my shock over how gripped by the Phantom my son was, and I think, like you said, Lauren, there is something primal there. And when he was watching it so intently, I kind of started like, because I mean, when I started watching the movie again, I was kind of thinking like, oh man, this acting and gosh, and so on and so forth. But then you look at it through the eyes of a radio serial or a cartoon strip, and you really, really feel that they tried to mirror the iconography in the cartoons and the comics that came before. And when I was sort of looking up the Phantom a little bit, apparently Billy Zane was really, he spent like a year and a half lobbying for this for the role of the Phantom, and he studied these comics so that he could pull off the proper poses, the mannerisms, and so on and so forth from them. And so when you kind of watch it through the eye, sort of like through the lens of, they are literally trying, like you would see these scenes, like for example, at the end of the movie when they're in that little submarine and like the island behind them is blowing up and turning into a volcano. Like that looks like it was taken straight out of a comic strip. And once you start kind of looking at it through that filter, it becomes more tolerable, I think.
Well, look, there's iconography that is common to this era of storytelling. And again, when talking about how your son reacted to it, think about how kids role play on the playground. There's a scene in this movie where he's suspended from underneath a bridge that is collapsing, and he's got this kid hanging onto his neck, and he has to use a pistol to shoot the vine to cut it on that end so he can swing across the chasm. This happened in all of these serials. It happens in pirate movies. It happened in Star Wars twice. First in A New Hope while swinging across the chasm where the bridge is out, and secondly off of Jabba's sail barge. It's a shot that everybody loves, and kids love to do that. You want to make kids excited? Put them someplace where there's a rope they can swing on and pretend that they're fighting pirates. It just goes to the way that children play.
The other issue about these prototypes of what became superheroes, they were in and of themselves intact, and yet they were serialable. I mean, you had to tell a story in 30 minutes or an hour and do it again next week and next week and next week and next week, like modern serials, except, of course, that, prime time used to be 36, 38, then it went to 29, then to 23, and then to 22. And now we're making shows for channels that start with a D and end in a plus of 8 shows or 10 shows where 3/4 of them are, let's all stand around and talk about life, the universe, exposition, and anything other than adventure.
And fold our arms.
That too.
Yeah, it's kind of funny in a way because, you think about this era of making these stories, and it's really, we're talking about initially radio, later serials, movies, and the like, but even in the original magazine shorts going back to the 1800s, this was the birth of the cliffhanger. And the whole reason for it was that you wanted to extend out this story. You had to leave them on a hanging note so that they would come and buy the next issue. It's really a smart marketing ploy.
The dawn of movies, the perils of Pauline. And of course, then they played on that when they made Batman in '66 with the 2 half hours a week with the cliffhanger in between. Yep. Holy heck, boys and girls, how will they get out of this one? Tune in on Thursday.
Same bat time, same bat channel.
Yeah.
Holy cliffhangers, Batman.
And that's literally where the term comes from, of course, is they'd be hanging over a cliff.
So I guess my next question to you guys is, as I said at the beginning of this, this conversation, there was a resurgence of these pulp heroes back in the 90s. There were a number of these movies that were made, like Phantom, The Shadow, The Rocketeer, Dick Tracy, and all that. And yet none of them ever got sequels. And so what are your thoughts as to why they, I guess, failed to launch really with audiences?
First of all, they all happened on the very dawning edge of the CGI revolution. And once people got really good at doing these massively spectacle, umpteen characters battling and rays and planets blowing, these were seen as weak and mediocre by comparison, whether they were or weren't.
Right.
Secondly, the 90s, we hadn't quite reached the end of history yet. There was a lot of depressing stuff going on, and these guys were such individuals that they weren't everyman the way that, well, I don't know, some of the other superheroes became.
I think I take a little issue with your premise because Batman got several sequels.
Right.
Well,
okay.
sure.
Okay.
It was what kind of kicked off all of the others. And the way I remember it is that I think The Shadow did fairly well. I know The Rocketeer was very well regarded. But I think that over time it sort of fell out of the public consciousness. Part of the problem may have been that they were just so far removed from what people at that time, the contemporary movie-going audience, knew. This was their grandparents' heroes, and they weren't as familiar with them as they would have been, say, with a Batman or a Superman. I think that may have been what doomed them.
It might also be the eras in which they took place. Look at Rocketeer. The bad guy isn't. But what do you do for a sequel when the war's over? You're in the fabulous 50s when everybody's busy working really hard for truth, justice, and 2 cars and a chicken in every pot. They had to explain the threat, first of all, because kids didn't know from in the 30s. They thought that all happened, in the 40s and was over in a couple of years. But secondly, where do you go from there? Look at the example of Indy in the refrigerator with the nuclear test site.
Oh, yeah.
They really had to stretch to make it something, more contemporary and still keep in the timeline of the character's age.
Lorn, I can see that vein in your head throbbing right now.
Well, this is why I kind of argue. This is why partially I wanted to do this kind of series, is because I think it's important to go back to these pulp heroes because they were a product of their time. And they are the kind of movies and shows and stories that you can't do anymore because we don't have a frontier anymore. We aren't really exploring the way that we were then. There is not some exotic locale that you can just escape to now. And granted, all of that was fanciful and mostly fictionalized in the first place. But it's why I think when Universal tried to do their Dark Universe here a little while ago, and they tried to do a mummy movie in the modern day, that's why that doesn't work. You have to do it like the Brendan Fraser mummy movies, where it's like, here we are in Egypt with an Indiana Jones style character having these kind of adventures in a far off land. That's fun. And if you try and do it in a contemporary setting, it just doesn't work.
Well, and the movies in contemporary settings that refer to periods of time before they take place, look at National Treasure. Look at there's several that refer to a historical period, but they're still taking place now, and it's really hard to do well.
Well, just to go back to what you guys were saying, a quick Google search showed that both The Shadow and The Rocketeer did turn profits off of their budgets. The Shadow was
barely for The Shadow.
It had a 40 million budget,
and they made
got
about 46 or 48,
48
something like
million.
That. Yeah.
And The Rocketeer had a 40 million budget and it made 46 million, but The Phantom was a bomb. It had a 45 million budget and only came out with 23.5 million at the box office. So I guess that answers my question then.
But it's still better than the Marvels.
That's true. That is a very good point. And
I know we always talk about, I shouldn't have even brought it up. We should have a show bereft of that stuff. But hey, we live in our time too. The other thing to remember is all of these movies, as much as they all hoped and certainly from what you said about Billy Zane lobbying for that character, they all hoped they would make sequels like crazy. All of them had to work as a movie all by themselves, and that's true of all the great running series. I mentioned Sherlock Holmes. They made the first one to make the first one, period. The Cisco Kid, the Tarzan movies with Johnny Weissmuller, which go back before that, of course, to Elmo Lincoln and whatever. But they never thought they'd make 6 or 7 or 8 of those the way they did. They never even imagined doing that.
Well, if I remember right, even Zorro, the first Zorro story was self-contained, and I believe he died at the end.
Yeah.
But it was so popular and everybody loved it, they just decided to ignore the fact that he died at the end and bring him back.
And I'll give you another little piece of weird history to show you how our times have changed. I mentioned that my mother worked on the Cisco Kid.
Yeah.
The opening was, here's action, here's adventure, here's O. Henry's famous Robin Hood of the Old West. They trusted that the audience knew who O. Henry was, let alone Robin Hood. You can't do that now.
Hey, that's a darn good chocolate bar. Come on.
And Baby Ruth was a heck of a pitcher, too, before they made him a third baseman and outfielder.
Well, guys, I think this has been a really fascinating conversation.
We have lots of genres ahead. Hey, everybody out there in the comments section, what would you like us to talk about next? We've mentioned a few amongst ourselves, but you're the audience. Let us please you.
Absolutely. Let us know what what you'd like to see, what you would like to hear, what you would like us to maybe watch and talk about. Drop a line down below. We would be very open to that. This is guided by you. Your interest in these discussions is what fuels these conversations, as Pro would like to say. So please do let us know what should we do next. And if you don't tell us, we'll come up with something on our own.
Yes. We dare you, because if not, you'll get our machinations.
Yeah, I think part of what I think is fun about this series is it gives us a chance to shine a light on some probably mostly older pictures that you might not be aware of, but nevertheless are good and potentially influential and shaped what eventually became contemporary filmmaking. So if you have any thoughts about what those are, what are some hidden gems that you know about that you think nobody else does?
And
those are the kind of...
Whether you buy them on disc or you watch them on streaming, the theaters are going to be pretty empty for the next year or two. So you may just need us to fill out your viewing schedule and in the process do like Tommy did and get your kids involved in a whole new generation of stuff they didn't know existed.
Next thing is I'm going to be showing them the Battlefield Earth movie.
Don't do that.
All right, guys. Sorry.
That better not be what the audience asks for next. So that's all I've got to say.
Get that whiskey ready. Well, guys, this has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for your time and for your wonderful insights. Audience, let us know what you think. Give us your comments, your feedback. Let us give it to us straight. And I hope you guys all have a wonderful week ahead. Go check out The Shadow. Go check out The Phantom if you can. Go check out all of those pulp movies and maybe even, read some of the comics and listen to some of the radio shows. I think I'm actually going to go back and do a little bit of that.
And they're all out there.
They're
all out there available. That's the great thing of the multiverse of madness that is the internet.
And they're usually better than the Marvels. And on that note, we will say goodbye and good night.
We hope you enjoyed that special presentation of The Genre Guys here on T3PO. Be sure to subscribe to this channel for more content like it, and if you want to enjoy episodes of The Genre Guys as soon as they are released, be sure to become a member at WDW Pro's YouTube channel. What were your thoughts on this amazing topic? Let us know in the comments below, and thank you for joining us here on T3PO. Please comment, like, and share this video, and don't forget to subscribe to That Park Place Podcasts Online, your source for exclusive content and highlights from WDW Pro, The Pro Show, and That Park Place for all the news that should be fun.